Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Pause for My Tail podcast. I am your host, Shepherd the Leopard, or Shep the Snep for short. Again, we're here with the wonderful 2Chaotic. The last episode, we went into just kind of like your early childhood, your upbringing into high school. And now we're going to go in from there. We'll talk about some of your furry experiences, maybe some of your experiences in like college and post-college life, and just how, being a furry has influenced that. And then also maybe talk about a little bit of the ADHD and autism that you've experienced and how you've identified that and how it's played into your life stories. So let's go from there. Let's talk about, so when we left off, we had just talked about how you found furry and you were in high school. Talk to us about like what happened after high school. What kind of life choices were you presented with after you had graduated?
So after I graduated, my goal was to go to college. And I had spent almost all of my high school career trying to get into one specific college. We had a college that was local to us that was kind of one of the top engineering schools in the nation and has been for many years. And I really wanted to go there because I knew that if I went there, that was going to be my ticket out. Because it's the kind of place where all the top tech companies came to recruit and their job fairs were legendary. And I'm like, if I can get in there, I can go anywhere. And then I can win the game of life. And the problem was, to get in there, is that they had a massive standard. I think at the time, you had to have an 1800 on the SAT. And for all you non-Americans out there, the SAT is our college entrance, one of our college entrance exams. And it's kind of a test on your math, your writing, and your English skills. And at the time, a perfect score was 2,400, but an 1,800 was still incredibly high. Like, it was not easy to get an 1,800 on the SAT. And specifically, in the school that I wanted to get into, you had to have a 1,200 on the math and English portions because nobody cared about the writing portion. Nobody cares about writing anymore, except me. And so I had studied my entire school career to take that test, to get into college, so that I could go to that school and make something of myself. I really wanted to be a computer engineer. I really wanted to make video games like every other millennial my age at the time. And so that was my goal. And I had to retake the SAT 3 times. My first score was just below it. My second score was just below it. But my third time, I think I got a 1960 on the SAT that time, and that was enough to get into the school. I actually had the second highest SAT score in our entire high school's history. That's how bad my classmates were. Like, we were not a well-off school.
Or it was at how good you were.
I guess you could frame it that way. But it was more like our school was not great in terms of academics. We were kind of one of the worst schools in the state, and there was not that much opportunity for people there. We had one class for everything. There was no real advanced classes. There was nothing to kind of get my teeth wet on if I wanted to go higher in my learning. And so that was just kind of what I had to deal with. So while we didn't have the best education, I still studied on my own to do this. And I got that test, I got the score, and I went to the college and I said, let me in. They sent me an acceptance letter and then they sent me the bill. And this is where my dreams got crushed, because when they sent me that bill, they wanted $50,000 a year after all of the scholarships and grants that I got to go to the school.
Whew.
And, this was 2008. That's a lot of money. And I did not have that amount of money, nor did my parents make that amount of money, nor did I ever conceive that I would have to pay that amount of money to go to the school. And so I suddenly faced a terrifying decision of take $200,000 out in private student loans for 4 years and probably ruin my adult life doing so. on the chance that I'll get out and become an engineer and maybe be able to pay that off, or not do that and figure out something else to do with my life. So, being the person that I am, I chose not to do that. And I kind of got crushed at that point because the entire thing I had spent the past 4 years doing suddenly was out of my reach. And there was no way I was going to be able to do that. And so at that point, I kind of started to reconsider my life choices. It's like, what do I do now? And at that point, I was still heavily into being a Catholic. I was still very devout Catholic. And I prayed a lot on this. And I'm like, okay, God, what do you want me to do? You've closed the door that I've been working at for the last 4 years, you son of a bitch. What do I do now? What do you really want me to do? Because you've obviously been, preparing me for this moment and then shut the door in my face. So what now? And at that point, my two choices either were three. I would have to, get a minimum wage job in the area and try to do something with that. Didn't want to do that. The other option was go to the backup college that I had applied to casually in the area, one of the local public universities, who had given me a scholarship, not a full ride, but, a little something that would have meant that, I could graduate with about $30,000 in debt. That wasn't the best school, but, it was better than all the other ones in the area, except for the engineering school. Or become a priest. And so there was one night I was in my room and I'm praying real hard. I'm like, God, what do you want me to do? I don't know what to do. There's no clear path forward. I don't know what's going on. I can't predict the future. What do you want me to do? So I said, okay, I'm going to take this quarter and we're going to flip a coin and we're going to let you decide, I guess. I'm going to flip this coin. Heads, I go to college. Tails, I become a priest. And I was fully ready to commit to that decision. I was fully ready to, if it became up tails, I was going to sign up at the seminary and get shipped off to become a priest. And if, it was heads, I was going to go to college and see what I could do with my life. But I was not going to go back. I was not going to renege on that. I was not going to, turn my back on either decision. Because obviously it was going to be the will of God. And so I flipped a coin, it landed on heads. So I'm here. I went to college. And my first year of college, I didn't really have any friends. It was suddenly school all over again. None of my friends from...
Before we go into college, though, I'm fascinated by this point that you pretty much put your future down to a coin flip. That you were so convinced that, that God was going to make up this decision based on where that coin landed, whether it was heads or tails. Like, what would have been in your life? Where would you be now if that coin flip had landed on heads? It's saying, that was your message from God that you needed to then go into the Catholic service and become a priest, like the seminary. Like, where would Chaotic be today if that coin flip had landed differently?
So, had that coin flip landed differently, I had already kind of experienced some of this because my mother, before she had me, was going to the local kind of Catholic college, and there was a lot of stuff surrounding about that I had learned about. And while I couldn't go there because it was a school only for girls, I could have gone to the male school, kind of a few states away, to become, seminary, to become a priest. And I had studied this option. I had been like, okay, the church will take care of me if I do that. They give you a stipend, they send you to a place, you become the priest of that church, and you lead the community. Well, if you become a priest, there's other options in that. You can become, part of the clergy, the laymen. You can do different office things for the church. You can, be sent around the world as a missionary, whatnot. There was a lot of different paths on that path. I may not necessarily become a priest. I may have been, support staff for the church or something. But I'm not sure that I would have came out of that the same person, because I had still been struggling with the shame of my kinks at that point and trying to suppress that side of me because I still thought it was wrong. And I'm not sure that I would have made a lot of the similar life choices if I'd gone that route. I don't think I would have opened up to the side of me that said, okay, you can have a boyfriend. Or I don't think I would have I definitely wouldn't have been furry much longer. I would have had to choose between that or the priesthood. I don't think that, I'm pretty sure they're two dichotic things. There was no choosing between them. And I would have lost all of my friends again. I would have to start over another time. And that scared me. But I really don't think that I would be sitting here. I don't think that I would have been able to survive that option for very long. But I would have tried to stay committed to it as long as I can, and I probably would have burnt out to the point that I may have done something stupid. I may have, driven off a cliff or something. Who knows? I may have been a good priest. I may have been a good community leader. I don't know. I may have grown into it. But I am who I am because of the choices that I've made.
Do you feel like, because you talked about the shame of having kinks, if you had gone the route of being a priest, do you feel like those kinks would have ever gone away? Would you just have had to suppress it? Because typically, like those things are just they're just a part of who we are. Like they don't really go anywhere. We can kind of try to suppress them, but they don't ever just leave. So like with that, do you think that there could have been some multiverse chaotic that coin flipped, and then you just, because of all that shame, like would you talk about how like you think that you would have ended up a priest, you wouldn't have become a furry, or do you think that there is that chance where because of those just being persistent that eventually, maybe delayed, but you would still end up where you are today? Is that at all a possibility? Or
because at least like there's a good story about this in the Bible, kind of, but I can't remember if it's Peter or Paul in the New Testament, but there's a nice passage where one of the two talks about how they have a thorn in their side and asks God to take it away from them, but God won't. And God basically tells them, you're going to have to deal with that. That is your burden to deal with, and that's what keeps you human. And that story always rung in my head at the time. And I knew that if I went to the priesthood that I would still struggle with my kinks and that I would have to suppress them. There was no way that could be open. There was no way that part of me would be allowed to flourish. And I mean, knowing what I know now, there was no way that was going to happen for me. Like the kinks are not something I could have suppressed forever, and I would have been driven crazy. Just having to suppress an entire, function of my body or suppress an entire side of my personality forever, I really don't think I would have gone through that. And I think that I would have eventually broken and either become a shattered person, or I would have gotten out and tried to do something else and be, 15, 20 years older and having to start over yet again. Mm-hmm. I don't think that my life would have been nearly as good had I gone that decision.
So you still had to overcome that belief system, though, in order to get to where you are, because you talked about how that thorn in your side, like that was a core belief that was causing that shame for you.
It was.
With who you were. So what caused that to change? Like, is there any kind of one, like a shelf breaking event where you just decide, hey, this isn't right, this doesn't work for me? Or is it like a gradual type thing? How did you overcome that belief to where it was no longer something that caused you shame, that you were able to then just kind of embrace that side of you?
Here's the funny thing about that. The thing that caused me to start changing that was I read the Bible. That was the one event that made me start to question my faith, was I actually read the Bible. Because at least in our church, in the Catholic church where I grew up, it wasn't like you should read your Bible, but you shouldn't read your Bible. Because in the Catholic faith, every Sunday when you go to church, there are two passages that are read from the Old Testament, and then the priest will speak a passage from the New Testament. Well, no, one of the four Gospels, never mind. But over the course of 6 years, you hear the entire Bible, except for the book of Revelation. You hear the entire Bible being spoken to you through church every 6 years. from, passage 1 to the end of the last book before Revelation. It's verbally told to you, but it's broken up into pieces, and then there are teachings to kind of help you understand it afterwards. But it's not encouraged to read it on your own. And that may have changed now, but that was still kind of the mindset back then. And so I actually went to read it for myself. And that's when I started to kind of grapple with a lot of things. I'm like, well, we have the whole Sodom and Gomorrah stories. You have a lot of stuff about in the New Testament about Jesus coming out against things that were in the Old Testament. It's like, well, yeah, we did that, but we're going to do it different now. And just a lot of these things that didn't really make sense to me. Like, why? Sure, I'm not God. I'm not a moral authority. I don't have infinite power. I don't have omniscience. But in my way of thinking, I'm like, well, why is this thing this thing? And when I would ask our priest about that or something, he'd be like, well, you really shouldn't be asking these kinds of questions. Like, what does that mean? Like, what do you mean I shouldn't be asking these types of questions? Like, if I'm having this problem with it, surely there's an easy explanation for it. And the more I would ask questions, the more I would get pushback from the people around me who I'd be posing these questions to. I'm like, why are people like pushing me away from these topics? And it just got to the point that my doubt grew and grew to the point that I'm like, well, maybe Catholicism isn't the way. I still was firmly in the Christian belief. And at that point, I kind of became non-denominational. I'm sure I was some form of flavor of denomination that I'm not sure what the name of it is. I don't know. But at that point, I stopped believing in the Catholic faith. Because for those of you not versed in it, the Catholic faith is slightly different from the normal Christian belief in that you have the papacy, the Pope, and the whole set of Catholic rules that are given by the Pope. Anything the Pope says officially is considered the Word of God. It's verbatim. Like, that's it. You listen to it, you believe it. And there's this whole additional set of rules in addition to the Bible. And I just had a real problem with that. Because there's the whole sainthood in Catholicism where people are considered to be saints after they get to heaven and after the papacy confirms that they become a saint by some miracle happening on earth that they're able to attribute to that person. And there's a lot of kind of basically worship of Mary in the Bible as like the mother of God. She's got this higher place among everybody else. If you pray to her, she'll intercede to God for you. And it doesn't say that anywhere in the Bible. There is at no point where God shares his power with another person. That just don't happen. And so a lot of these things didn't add up. And I'm like, this can't be right. There's got to be something wrong here. Sure, it may have been around for 2,000 years, but we've been wrong about things before. We thought the earth was flat. We thought the sun was, going around the earth. Like, we're not infallible. And that just made me start to question everything I believed in. And so I went on this huge doubting spree about my entire core beliefs. And I became non-denominational. I went to a different local church, much to the behest of my family. They did not like that one bit. It caused a lot of tension between me and my parents. But I went my own way for the first time. Up to that point, I was pretty complacent. I followed the path that was set before me. This was really the first time where I deviated from it. And it made me have to learn how to stand up to my parents, whereas I'd never done that before. I had never been my own person up to this point. And especially with, the furry side, the kink side that was growing on me. This is kind of where my life started to diverge from the rest of my family. And that was my freshman year of college, really. I didn't really have any friends at college the first year. None of my classmates went to college with me, so I was alone again. And on a campus with 20 other thousand people, I had a bit of a culture shock. That was a big problem for me. So back where I grew up, I think in the 2010 census, the population of where I grew up, of 22,000 people, had 0.01% non-Caucasian. It was all white all the time, and there was any kind of influence from any other culture at all. So I get to college, And suddenly I'm in the minority. Our campus was, I think 70% African American, and there was 20,000 people. So this was a big culture shock for me. And I suddenly had to grasp with the fact that I was no longer, the homogenous culture. There was suddenly a lot more different types of opinions. There was a lot more different ways of living. There was a lot more, difference in music. There was difference in food. We had people from all over the world at our campus. I mean, heck, we had a Buddhist monk who was on campus who would wear nothing but the monk robes every day of the year and would walk barefoot in 6 inches of snow like it was nothing. There was people of all types. We had so many different experiences where I just did not grasp what people were trying to convey to me because I wasn't familiar with that in any way, shape, or form. And God, I'll never forget.
You went from, having your family, feeling like things were going good in high school, having a few friends, to then just completely uprooting all of that, going to college and being alone, having your faith challenged, and in an environment that was completely foreign from how you had grown up. Like, how does that feel? How do you deal with all of, like, just the loneliness, the internal conflict, the changes? Like, how that had to have been difficult, not to say the least,
Oh, it was certainly difficult. Like, I didn't have any, real life friends at that point at college. All of my friends were online at that point. That's when I really started to get into furry more. And that was when I discovered the wonders of IRC chat. And God, I'm old. It feels weird that there's probably a section of furries that don't know what IRC chat is, much like they didn't know what dial-up was.
Yeah, why don't you explain what was IRC?
So for people who are familiar with Telegram or Discord, IRC was a chat protocol much similar to that, but it's all just a text-based chat. You would jump onto an IRC server that would have text channels on it, like a Discord server. You couldn't see them unless you joined one of them. So there would be different topics in all these different chats. Like there would be one chat that was solely for, like, TF. There'd be a chat for pause. There'd be a chat for, this local variety of furry group. There would be a chat for, this person would start their own chat and have their friends in it. Or it was all topic based. It was still the early days of the internet where forums were still a thing. And IRC chat was kind of the main way that a lot of people talked to each other outside of the bigger messengers at the time, like AOL, or MSN, or Trillion, or other things like that. And so I was actually part of a Christian fur group at that time. That was kind of my first group of furry friends. So that was what was familiar to me, and that was where I jumped off into furry at, for better or worse. And they weren't the most stable people, not gonna lie. None of the furs that I really knew back then were the most stable people. Not that I was either, but we all kind of had similarities in that most of us were the outcasts of society, and we'd all banded together to, be friends with one another. And so there wasn't really any preconceived notions of people. I mean, behind a text wall, you can't tell that someone is a different culture. You can't tell that they're, from Peru or, Germany or something. And it was just an easy way for me to make friends. And I made a lot of my early fur friends back then. And so I didn't need people at college, more or less. I would get done with my classes, I would go exercise a bit, and then I would come back and get on IRC chat and play TF2 with people or something.
So that internet community kind of became your just general community in a sense. Like still had people around you, you were at college, but you didn't really connect too well with a lot of them. So that need for connection was kind of fulfilled through these early days of your online interacting with other furries on IRC.
It was definitely my found family, my social group, and what I relied upon for my emotional support. Because even at college, like my freshman year, I was pretty cringe back then.
How cringe? Give us an example.
I wore a tail to class. I had made my own tail back then, and it was kind of the colors of our mascot at our school. And I just wore it around. People thought I was the mascot. It was kind of fun. But there was definitely lots of people who were like, you're a weirdo. And even though, people are adults at a college, some of them didn't act like it. Nobody ever bullied me at college. Nobody cared. Mm-hmm. We were just there to go to class.
And this was before furry was actually like, I still don't think furry is necessarily mainstream, but I think it's at least like understood at a greater sense than it has been in the past. Like back then, nobody knew what furry was. Like if you wore a tail, they wouldn't associate the two.
Yeah. I mean, hardly anybody knew what it was. Nobody ever called me a furry. And nobody ever called me the derogatory furry names at the time either. Like the greatest exposure that most people had to furry back then probably was, that one infamous CSI episode, or, some of the episodes of 1,000 Ways to Die, or just like the really bad takes of furry. If you weren't deep into internet culture, that's probably the only thing that you'd ever seen if you'd seen them. So it wasn't like people knew what Trekkies were. Nobody knew what a furry was. And so I still kind of lived in anonymity that way, and that protected me from a lot of what may have been more criticisms of that. So, and there was times where I incorporated that into like my class papers and whatnot, where I had taken a speech class, and well, I didn't want to take speech class, it was mandatory. And I took the speech class, and they're like, what's one weird thing about yourself that no one would ever guess, that this was a thing? And so I gave a 20-minute lecture on the furry fandom to my speech class.
Wow.
And that was fun. And then the person directly after me came up and gave a 20-minute lecture about Michael Jackson. Our class was weird. But everybody seemed to perceive it okay. Nobody seemed to care. I mean, people were just there to get a grade and leave, more or less, as far as I could tell. And things really only changed my sophomore year. That was really when I started to say, okay, I can't just be online forever. I need to actually find people to hang out with. And that was when I started to go to kind of the school common areas for lunch, and I finally found a group of people that were playing Magic the Gathering all the time. I had never played Magic, but one day I just kind of sat down at their table, and I'm like, so, what's this game you're playing? Teach me. And that was my way of screaming for friendship. And they were nice. They were like, okay, we'll teach you how to play and whatnot. And I became friends with most of these people. And they were all kind of part of a kind of tabletop board game, card game club at the campus. So every Friday night we would have club night up in the commons area. And there would be probably 100 people there. And we'd all be playing, Magic the Gathering or Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of people played Warhammer. There were people playing other weird games, whatever they thought. And even the people that were playing like D&D and stuff, you could just go in and sit and watch them play D&D, even if you weren't playing. And so you would just get to know all these we were all a bunch of nerds. Well, most of them knew what furry was.
And back then too, like these were all nerdy activities, but in the truest sense, like nerd culture wasn't what it is today, where things like Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering, like you had to be very nerdy, and it was not popular at all to participate in any of those games. In fact, in some, especially in maybe a culture that you grew up in, some of those could have been seen as just outright like devilish or demonic and heavily discouraged. So like back in those times, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. Yeah.
Yeah, like if anybody has streamed the first season of Stranger Things, or I guess the third season, the satanic panic around D&D was a thing. And that was kind of part of where I grew up at. I mean, heck, where I grew up at, like, I think I grew up 10 miles from the previous Grand Master of the KKK. Like, I was deep in the shit up there. And so anything seen as, a cult or anything like that, even a simple game like D&D, was frowned upon. It was demonic. It was the devil. Don't do that, whatnot. And I went to college and people were just casually playing it. I'm like, well, this is a cool game. And I really got into it. And we would do that basically every Friday. And it was fun. And it was a good time, to the point that I became friends with all these people and finally found, a place that I could be. And I was definitely openly furry around them. There was no hiding it from them. I mean, they knew what furry was. Some of them still had the preconceived notion of, oh God, furry bad, but most of them were pretty cool about it. And I still had my online friends at the time, but I kind of took a step back from them a little bit and went more with the real life option. And I never found another furry at my campus. Either they didn't find me. I don't know how, like, even with the signaling and boring a tail around campus, like, I don't know how I never found another furry among 20,000 people. I don't know how that happened. But that's kind of when things started to turn around, until kind of most of the way through my sophomore year of college. I had went to school for computer programming, and I was having a real hard time with it. It wasn't that the classes were hard, it's that the teachers were hard to learn from. I had a lot of teachers who would mumble. I had a lot of teachers who wouldn't teach out of the book. And this is kind of where the ADHD kind of started to come to light. Because when I was in school, in high school, it was so easy that, and everybody taught from the book, that as long as I read the book, I was fine. I would get A's. I would pass every test. I didn't have to pay attention to class as long as they taught out of the book, and that's what you did in the high school. There was no off-book script, because you would be running afoul of the state education standards or something. But in college, that was not the case anymore. I couldn't just read the book and be fine. I had to pay attention in class. I had to study. I had to do the homework all the time. And I really started to struggle with that around that time, especially in the programming aspect, because it's not easy to pick up if you're not familiar with computers. So I was really familiar with computers by that point. I had a vocational class in high school that taught me computer maintenance. That was a whole other thing. And I had come to college with that. I had came to college with a computer certification. Like, I entered college with 32 credits. And the person processing my entrance was like, what? You just skip half a semester or a whole semester. So instead of doing that, I instead took 4 classes every semester, so I would have a lighter workload. And I'm glad that I did, because if I had any higher workload, I don't think I would have made it through college. But struggling to understand these professors while they were teaching, and even sitting at the front of the class, I couldn't hear them. I couldn't understand what they were writing half the time, because they all wrote like doctors, and I just really started to struggle at that point. And my sophomore year, I no longer lived on campus. I had to commute from home to school, and it was about an hour drive every day. So I was getting up earlier. I wasn't getting enough sleep. I would have to come to school, be there until 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, try to do my homework, go home and go to bed. I didn't have time for myself anymore. I didn't have time to hang out with people. And so all my coping mechanisms were now gone. So that's when I really started to discover the ADHD, and I didn't know that's what it was. I just knew that there was something wrong with me. I couldn't keep up with everybody else, even though I knew I was smart. I knew I could do work. I knew that I could do this, but I couldn't do this. There was something in my brain that was preventing me from being able to focus, from being able to engage with the class, from being able to do the work. And it certainly wasn't for a lack of trying.
Well, and you'd also come from an environment where, learning wasn't as important. You probably didn't have the support to, be prepared for that kind of environment. And then you also probably didn't have the support when it came to identifying those kinds of issues, ADHD and such. I mean, back then it was probably still very heavily stigmatized. You didn't talk about it. If you had any kind of symptoms of it, you just kind of sucked it up. Did that influence at all how, you were managing, how, whether you even identified that in yourself, any of the stigma attached to that?
That the stigma was a huge thing, because everybody just told me, oh, you're lazy. That's why you can't do it. It wasn't you have a problem. It's that you are the problem. And I would go to professors and be like, hey, I don't understand what you're saying. Can you explain this to me, again? And they would just blow me off. They'd be like, come to my TA sessions. I would go to their TA sessions, and they would have a student there leading the TA session. And I would ask them about it, and they would try to explain things to me, but they weren't a teacher. And I just couldn't pick up stuff. So I knew that there was something wrong. I knew that there was something wrong with me, and I didn't know what. And fortunately, in my freshman year, I'd had an introduction to psychology class. So we had kind of covered ADHD, but it was still kind of the old version of ADHD, where it was, everything is extremely hyper expressed, where, you're the kid that can't sit down in class. You're the kid that, blurts out random stuff. You can't focus. You're driven like a motor. It's the old version of ADHD. It really wasn't talked about the second version of ADHD, where it's called ADHD inattentive, where you have three flavors of ADHD. There's hyperactive, there's inattentive, and then there's combined. Where hyperactive is the one that most people are probably familiar with, where it's, the kid that can't sit down or gets around, talks in class, throws stuff, rowdy. They're energetic all the time. They don't ever shut up. But the inattentive side is not really seen. It's not a visible thing. You're not driven. You don't have all this boundless energy. It's more, you can't focus if something doesn't hold your attention. If it's not something that interests you, you have to actively try to focus on it, and that gets very tiring. And it's other things like you're daydreaming in class, or you're listening to someone, but you don't hear what they're saying. It's going in one ear and out the other. You have a lot of problems with, social cues, picking up a lot of things that aren't readily apparent. But you'll also hyperfixate at times on things that you very much enjoy. So that's the weird part, is people say, oh, well, you can focus on video games for 20 hours a day, or you can focus on this weird topic that you enjoy for 20 hours a day. Why can't you do your homework? Why can't you pay attention to class? We know that you can do this, but you don't do it. You're just lazy. And, there's something wrong with you. You're not, correct. You're not normal. It's you that's got the problem, and you need to suck it up and deal with it. And that was the attitude towards it, especially where I lived. And I'd asked my doctor about ADHD, and he's like, nah, you can't have it. You're in college. The whole stigma of it was that someone with ADHD is that hyperactive, the unsuccessful, the reckless person who's probably working a dead-end job somewhere because they can't hold a job. And I actually went to the dean of the psychology college because I had to get counseling sessions. I was starting to have anxiety attacks at this time. When I couldn't deal with it anymore, I started to have anxiety attacks. And so I went to counseling at the school because it was kind of free. I didn't have to pay for it. So I'm like, okay, sure, it's free. I'll go do it. That's fine. And I somehow ended up with the dean of the psychology college as my counselor because they were short-staffed. And I explained to him my symptoms, about what I was feeling. I got out my psychology book that I still had and went through the ADHD symptom list. I went through the DSM guide. I had done my research a little bit. And I'm like, hey, I think I have this. What do you think? And he's like, nah, you can't have it. You're in college. You're sitting here talking to me in college. You've been able to get past all these barriers that would have blocked you.
Even the professor, the dean of the psychology department, even him, he was like, no, this is what does that do to a person when you think that you have figured out what it is, to then have the supposed expert come and be like, no, you're just lazy.
Yeah. And he told me that you just have a problem with laziness. You have a problem with attention. It's not ADHD. People with ADHD, they're not successful. They can't get to college. They don't do these things. It has to really affect your life for it to be ADHD. It's not affected your life well enough. You just need to try a little harder. You need to do these things to try harder. And that's when I said, okay, you're the expert, I guess. I guess it's not ADHD. I guess I'm just lazy. And it just kept reaffirming that stigma over and over again, that anytime I couldn't do something, it was because I wasn't trying hard enough. It was because I didn't approach it in the manner that everybody else approached it. And that even though I was studying 3 to 4 hours a night, I still couldn't keep up with my coursework. And I had went through my entire high school. I had straight A's and B's, honor roll, everything. college, I was getting C's. I was getting B's, like in classes that I was good at most of the time. And things like English, where I was good at writing, I was getting B's and C's. Like, what is going on here? And one of my major scholarships required that I keep a 3.5 on my GPA. And I was starting to dip to getting below it. And I'm like, I can't lose this scholarship. I won't be able to afford school. I was already maxed out on my student loans. And so at that point, I'm like, well, I have a big decision to make. I either keep trying to be a programmer in a place where I can't learn to be a programmer, or I fall back on something I know. And so I went and changed my major to information technology, IT's work, which is, more computer maintenance stuff that I already knew. And once I did that, I fared a lot better, but that was only because I already had the knowledge. I didn't have to learn it. I didn't have to study for these things. I'd already known it. I had taken this vocational class where I learned all of it already. And like one of my classes in IT was to study for the Network Plus CompTIA certification. That was the whole class. And the teacher said, if you get this certification, you get an automatic A in the class. If you don't, there'll be an exam, whatnot. The first weekend of that semester, I bought the book for the cert. I studied the cert. I crammed it in a weekend. I went and took the cert on Monday. I walked into class on Tuesday evening, plopped the certification on his desk, and he said, okay, you get an A. You don't have to come into the rest of the semester. And I inherently understood this a lot better. But it wasn't what I wanted to do.
It sounds to me like in that regard, like the ADHD, even though it was a hindrance in some regards, maybe it was helpful in others, like your ability to just sit down and get hyper focused on a thing. Like, even though sometimes you don't have control over what that is, that can be a bit of a superpower in a way too. Like, oftentimes I think that we talk about, we call them disabilities, but they're really just something that's abnormal, where we're just different from the majority of people, but not necessarily in bad ways, just different ways that sometimes are maladaptive to society. But did that kind of play in? Like, was that like one of the benefits of the ADHD, where you were able to hyperfocus on that? Or has ADHD just always been a net negative for you?
So a lot of people like to frame it that way, that they're like, oh, well, you can't do these things, but you can hyperfocus on these things. That must be good, right? Well, as someone who's lived that their whole life, and I have a lot of periods of hyperfocus where I get interested in something and I disappear from the world for 3 weeks because that's become my world all of a sudden. But the benefit of hyperfocus comes at the detriment of everything else. Because if I didn't have my bills memorized and when I need to pay them, I would forget to pay them. If I didn't have all these coping mechanisms that I've built over the years, I don't think I would be able to hold a job. And had I not transitioned to IT in college, I wouldn't have been able to get a job because I would have probably flunked out after losing my scholarship and I wouldn't have finished. If I didn't have that to fall back on, I wouldn't have been able to do this. With ADHD, the detriments of not being able to focus when I need to, of not being able to pay attention to people, I don't know if you've noticed while we've been sitting here, I barely looked you in the eye once on my screen.
Well, it is VR, so it makes it a little difficult to notice that.
I know. I know it's harder to notice, but I've been looking that way this whole time because one of the things involved with ADHD, and it's also a symptom of autism, is I have a hard time making eye contact with people. And even in a virtual space where I know that you're looking at me, but you're not looking at me at the same time, I still can't do it. And a lot of people back then thought that I was disrespecting them by not looking them in the eye when I talked to them. And that affected every social interaction I ever had. And professors would, people would say, look at me when you're talking. And then they would take a different tone with me. And it would affect my stance with them. And that would color every conversation afterwards. And just a lot of these little things that on their own may not be that big of a problem. Like not being able to focus to do your homework for, more than half an hour a night. In high school, that's not much of an issue. In college, that's a huge problem. But in, the adult world, I have a job where I'm an IT worker. I work at an IT help desk. I have tickets that come in. I have to do these tickets. Most of them don't last more than 10, 20 minutes to fix them. There are tickets that come in that take 8 or 9 hours to fix. Those are the ones that cause me problems because they lose their novelty after about 10 minutes, and I suddenly can't focus on what I'm doing. And if I get caught doing that too many times, I'm going to get fired. I'm going to lose my livelihood. Whereas when I have tried to do programming since college, I struggle a lot with it because it's not inherently interesting to me, but it's something that I want to do. But because the novelty has long wore off, I can't get my brain to move to focus on it for more than maybe 10, 15 minutes at a time. And the only way that I've been able to find myself to be able to do it is by forcing myself to hyper-focus on it. But to do that, I have to be in a certain mindset. I have to have certain physical stuff around me. I have to be alone. I have to be isolated. I have to turn off all my technology. I have to, have showered. I have to have eaten. I have to have done all these hygiene things that I have trouble doing a lot of the time. Because habits are a lot harder for someone to build with ADHD if they're not interesting. So things like, brushing my teeth every morning. I forget to do that a lot. Stuff like putting on deodorant. I forget to do that a lot. I forget to shower some days. I just get up, I eat breakfast, I walk out the door, and then I remember, oh God, I got to work and I forgot to shower. Things that are, someone who may or may not have a normal sensitivity would go, how could you possibly have forgotten that? Or I misplace my wallet all the time. I have a place to put it when I walk in the door. It doesn't end up there a lot of the time. And then if it's not there, when I go to leave in the morning, I don't know where it is. And I have to spend 20 minutes looking for it, and then I'm late to work. They're not huge things on their own, but because society expects me to act a certain way, that's why it's a problem. So, especially when it came to college and everyone reaffirming the fact that I was just lazy, it put a lot more shame and guilt on me, and it made the job even more stressful, to the point that even the classes that I knew about with IT, I still had problems in. There was a class in my senior year that was to study for the Security Plus certification. And I basically phoned in that course. There was no way that I could do it because it wasn't something that I was familiar with. And it was all on Blackboard, that evil application that I hope people nowadays don't have to deal with.
And we won't even describe it because we don't want to torment people by what it was.
Oh, no. People can be tortured as I was tortured. So Blackboard, for those of you who aren't aware, at least at the college level, was kind of a discussion board that would be used in classes to give out homework or to do presentations or things where if a class involved Blackboard, and a lot of the classes that I had my senior year did were Blackboard only, I didn't go into a class. They would, have a thing on the Blackboard that says, do this thing, put it on this discussion board, and then you have to comment on 5 other people's posts, some thoughtful comment about their homework assignment that they did. And that's a nightmare.
Yep.
No one wants to do that. I'm not, an engineer. I don't sit and read, scientific journals all day. I'm not going to recreate an experiment.
Especially for someone that you've described as yourself, that you have ADHD, you haven't done a lot, you're not a terribly social person with your fellow classmates. So to be forced to go on discussion boards, to remember to do that, that's super, that's not easy. I'm sure there are times where you just forgot to do it. There are times you just didn't want to do it. It felt probably hollow to you to go and do those things. It was that kind of your experience as you were forced to interact on Blackboard?
I don't think I submitted a Blackboard assignment until 20 minutes before it was due, if then. There was a lot of times on Blackboard where I would submit those weird comment on other people's posts 2 minutes before the deadline. There's a lot of times I just forgot. One professor put the final exam on Blackboard, and I knew that finals week, that's when the exams were. his final exam was due the day before finals week. So Monday of finals week, I load up Blackboard to take the exam. It had already closed. I couldn't take it. I got a 0 on the exam. I almost failed that class because of that. And when I'm like, why didn't you put the exam up during finals week? They're like, well, why didn't you read the syllabus? I'm like, I did, but that was at the start of the semester. That was 3 months ago. I'm not going to remember that. Why would you even think that everybody would remember that? I wasn't the only person who missed it. And I didn't like that class anyway. It's fine. But then there were other classes where I excelled in because of my ADHD, because I found them very interesting. But those were the outliers. Like, most of the classes weren't that way. And so I struggled all the time. I couldn't focus on the homework. Like, I don't think most people find calculus interesting. I almost loved that class. The only reason I didn't was because the teacher felt bad for me, because he saw me trying so hard and coming to the TA sessions and everything, that he gave me an alternate final exam after I failed the first one. He gave me an easier final out of the kindness of his heart. That's the only reason I passed that class.
Well, that was good of them, though.
And that was the only cool teacher I had. The rest of them were crazy. Oh, God. I forgot about the political science class. Oh, this was a weird one. My freshman year, I had a political science class that I had to take because my scholarship forced me to take honors classes. So I had to take this honors political science class. And we come in the first day, the teacher, gives us this demographic test where we're supposed to, write down all of our positions on things, basically figure out if we're Democrat, Republican, whatever. I put all my answers in, and this was still when I was pretty heavily Christian. My views were a lot different back then. I'm a much different person now. But next day I come to class. Teacher's like, well, this has never happened before. There were 100 students in this class. 99 of them had all put in their applications and everything, and all 99 of them were heavily Democratic. There was one person who wasn't. That person was me. I was a centrist at that time, for better or worse. I don't like centrism anymore. I'm very much on the far left. But I have definitely been radicalized by society into a crazy person. But back then, I was still pretty in that way of old thinking. And the teacher's like, this has never happened before. I have never had a class where we didn't have, like 30% Republicans or something. So she called me out by name. And I'm like, yeah, that's me. And she's like, you and me are going to be friends. And every single assignment in this class was a big speech that you had to do. And it was to either, defend or approve a certain political position on something. And her class was always set up so that it would be, the Democrats versus the Republicans. Well, because we didn't have a Republican, she's like, I'm going to try something different this year because you're the only one that's, not far left. You're going to be the only person defending this side for the first assignment. And we're going to see how this goes. So all 99 of the other classmates were working together on a presentation, whereas I had to come up with the opposite viewpoint and give a 20-minute presentation by myself in 3 days. And I blew this one out of the water somehow because I just did not like this lady anymore. And I'm like, I'm going to show you. And so I put my heart and soul into this because that was one of the other things that I could hyper-focus with is sheer rage. But so I forced myself into a hyper-focus for 3 days and came up with this banger of a presentation. I don't even remember what it was on. I was just angry. And she's like, okay, well, we're going to keep this format for the rest of the semester then, since you apparently can handle it.
So you had dug your own grave, essentially.
I had dug my own grave. But it forced me to challenge a lot of my beliefs. As much as I hate to say it, that class was good for me because it forced me to dig into all these political positions and learn the histories about a lot of different things. And as much as I hated that class by the end of it, oh God, I hated that class by the end of it. It made me think. And I guess that was the goal of the class, was to make you think. And she accomplished her job with me, I guess. But, oh, that was such a crazy class.
So talking about making you think, and also focusing on ADHD, because we spent a good amount of time on this, and we'll end this episode of the podcast.
Off topic, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you've been on topic. I want to focus in on one thing that you talked about, and we'll end this podcast with that. And then if you're okay, we'll finish up your life story in another episode after this one. But
you think it's only going to be one? You're funny.
It might be more. But I want you just to, we talked about ADHD, and it's fine if you jump ahead a bit on this. But how did you finally, you had that professor that told you didn't have it. How did you finally get the diagnosis? And what kind of, what have you done to improve it? How has that made a difference in figuring that out? Because for me, you went and you described a lot of what those symptoms were, and I'm like, oh no, I probably have this too. And I'm just always thinking of myself as lazy when I just have a very hard time focusing. So what are some of the things, how did you get diagnosed? How did you finally figure out that's what it was? And then how has life been since having that treated?
So after that experience with that dean telling me you're just lazy and this is the expert on the subject, I shelved it for several years. I said, okay, I don't have ADHD. I'm just lazy, apparently. So I didn't think about it for many years. And after I graduated college and, found a job, moved to big city and whatnot, I didn't think about it for a long time. So I started to have this was probably 8 or 9 years later, I started to have a lot more problems focusing at work again. And I was having issues doing some of these new projects that I had been put on. I'm like, why can't I do this? I've done everything else just fine. But my first job out of college I was another IT person. I was still working in IT help desk. That was really my first real job out of college. And I stayed at that job for 10 years. But at about year 6 or 7, about 6 months before the pandemic started, I started to struggle with some programming projects that they had put me on because we didn't have a programmer at the time that could work on these projects. And I'm like, I know a little bit of programming, kind of. And because I wanted to get my feet wet with it again, I said, I'll try it. It doesn't sound very hard in theory. Well, I learned very quickly that the programming that I learned in college was not this kind of programming. And so I struggled a lot to do it. And because it wasn't interesting, it wasn't fun, I had a real hard time doing it. So when it came time to kind of show my work to say, hey, this deadline's coming up, what do you got for me? I'm like, uh-oh, I don't got anything to show you really. And so I hyper-focused like I would normally do to get out of this crunch. And I put together something and I threw it up for a presentation. And then he's like, okay, this seems good. We're going to show it to all of our customers now. I'm like, oh God, I can't do this. And so in the middle of all that, I'm like, I'm really having a hard time. I need to go see a therapist. I was no stranger to therapy. I had to do it kind of in high school after my dad died when I was 16. Well, a little bit before that, but mostly kind of before that and after. I had to go to a therapist, mostly because the court ordered me to. After my back surgery, I didn't go to see my dad for a couple of years, and the court didn't like that. So they made me and him go to therapy. Well, he never showed up, so I just got free therapy out of it. And so I was really no stranger to therapy. That's why I went to college, to go see the dean. 'Cause I'm like, I need help. I'm having problems. What's going on? So I said, well, okay, I'm having problems at work. Let's go to a therapist. Maybe there's something else wrong going on here. So I go to a therapist, and I'm like, what's wrong with me? And they're like, you're anxious and depressed. Here's a bunch of anti-anxiety medication. None of that was working for me. If anything, it was making it worse. Because I have a lot of problems. Here's another physical condition I have. I'm very sensitive to a lot of psychotropic medications. like SSRIs, depression pills, anxiety pills, a lot of things that affect certain parts of the brain just don't work very well with me. And I get a lot of extreme side effects. So they gave me these pills for depression that are supposed to work with anxiety. And instead, it was causing serotonin syndrome instead of fixing the problem. So instead of correcting the serotonin issue that is causing the depression, it was making me have way too much serotonin. And that causes you to go manic. So instead of, being a normal, chilled out, mellow, like the drugs are supposed to do, I had the extreme other side of the spectrum where I was manic all the time. I was angry. I was agitated. I couldn't sleep. I had all this energy that I couldn't deal with. And it also, unfortunately, causes sexual side effects. So I all of a sudden lost that coping mechanism of my kinks because I could no longer kind of use those body parts anymore because they misfunction when you're on those medications. And that's a little infuriating, is probably the word to describe it. I no longer have these outlets. And so I went back to the therapist and I'm like, hey, this is not working. I am going insane. There's got to be something else going on here. And so they're like, okay, let's flip through the DSM guide to see what other problems this could possibly be. Because for those of you not immersed in mental health terminology, there's this book in psychology called the DSM Manual. And basically a bunch of scientists get together in Europe every few years and figure out, well, what are the actual diagnoses that we can give people in psychology? What are their symptoms? What new stuff has come into studies? We're going to put it all in a book, mail it to every psychologist and go, here you go. Here's the range of what people can have. Here's their symptoms. Figure it out. And so this guy pulls out the book. He's like, well, this kind of sounds like ADHD, but I'm not really sure on that. I'm like, excuse me? You mean it sounds like this thing that I thought that I had back in college? Let's go deeper into that, shall we? And he's like, okay, I guess I'll give you the test for it. And his test was reading 7 questions out of the book and me answering, yeah, I have that. It wasn't very involved. It was not a very good test. And he's like, well, the way you answer all these questions indicates that you might have ADHD. Like, cool, thanks. And so he prescribed me Ritalin. And I took the Ritalin, and for the first time in my life, the voices that I had in my head constantly, the static, the music that's constantly playing, because I have, it's almost like there's 8 radios playing in my head at once, almost all the time. All of that noise suddenly quieted. I could suddenly focus. I suddenly had no problems at work. Like, I could sit there and focus on programming for hours at a time and not be hyper-focusing. I could take breaks. I could come back to it. I was suddenly remembering things that I would normally forget. Like, I would remember where my wallet is every morning. I would remember where I put my keys last night. I suddenly had the ability to just not think. And the medicine just changed my life. But the problem is because I had that aforementioned physical problem with drugs, I started to have a lot of side effects on Ritalin. I would have my heart start racing all the time. And even though it wasn't actually racing, I could feel it racing. And it caused me a lot of anxiety. And on the Ritalin, it raises your anxiety level naturally. That's kind of one of its natural side effects, is it raises your background anxiety. And so I would have a lot more anxiety attacks. And the side effects got so bad that I went back to the doctor and I'm like, I need this medicine, but I can't stand these side effects. What else is there to try?
That's got to be terribly frustrating to finally feel like you have found something that was finally helping you with the problem you've had, only to then have those side effects like really scare you of the aspect of, well, am I able to take this? Am I able to get this kind of treatment? Like that for me would be like a very scary situation to be in, to finally have that prospect of being better, but at the same time knowing that you might not be able to use it.
I was terrified of that because I'm like, this has done wonders for me, and I'm on the lowest dose of these medications. And I'm like, if I take any higher dose, I'm just going to scream. Like, I'm not going to be able to handle it. But it may, I may be better at work, but I'm going to have anxiety attacks at home, and I'm not going to be able to sleep. I was having insomnia out the wazoo. But that's my reaction to these medications. Everyone's reaction is different. Like, even if you went and got diagnosed, say you do have ADHD and went and got diagnosed, your experience on Ritalin may be completely different from mine. It may work for you perfectly. It may make you want to jump off a cliff. Like, everybody's experience is different. And so I had to go through this regimen of trying new medications and, experiencing side effects for a few weeks, or saying, well, this one didn't do anything at all. It just made me, have migraines all day. And I did have one that for 2 weeks, I had a migraine constantly until the medication finally wore off. It was terrible. But just all these different side effects, it really scared me that I'm like, I finally found something that has fixed the problem I've had all these years. I mean, it's not a cure-all. It didn't, just make me focus. I still had to be in a place where I could focus. I still had to put away my distractions. But when I had taken the proper steps to be able to do a task, I could do it. Suddenly, I didn't have problems with doing it anymore. Like, I could remember to do the dishes when I got home from work. I could remember to pick up my room. I could remember to actually fold my laundry instead of throwing it in the closet. And I could do these programming projects a lot easier, even though I didn't find any interest in them. And having the thought of that and not just experiencing that, having it taken away from me because I can't handle the medication. Oh God, I was terrified. And the doctor tried so many different medications on me, and none of them worked really well until I got to Adderall. And I'm sure everybody's heard of the name Adderall by now because it's got a lot of stigma. But the lowest dose of short-release Adderall is what works for me. I still get side effects from it. It completely eliminates my appetite. I had to force myself to eat. I forget to eat completely when I'm taking it. And I stutter a lot when I take it. It gives me a stutter for some reason. And it does raise my background anxiety. I'm kind of a grouch when I'm on it sometimes. But it's the only thing that allows me to focus for long periods of time without entering hyperfocus and forgetting everything else exists. Because that's the problem.
Are you on it right now for this podcast?
I did not take it today, no.
Wow, you've done really well focusing.
This is me without medication. But, I mean, that's only because I do streaming on a regular basis. I'm able to sit here and talk for long periods of time now because I've had the practice from that.
So it's not become something that you have to rely on every day. It's really just something that you take when you know you need.
For me, yes. But there's a lot of times where that's not the case. Like, there are times where I don't take it for a week or two. But then the first day after I take it again, all is right in the world. And I'm like, why did I not take this the rest of the time? But the other problem with these medications, especially with Adderall, Ritalin, and the more short-release forms of medication, your system will build a tolerance to them. And the same dose over time will not have the same effect for very long. So a lot of the times, doctors will recommend to not take it every day. Well, that's like saying I only get to work 5 days out of the week. I just suddenly have to, not do anything on the weekend. If I want to take it on the weekend, I usually skip a couple days at work. And that hinders my performance at work all of a sudden. And people are like, why didn't you do this thing yesterday? I'm like, I forgot. I didn't take my medication. Oops, sorry. And that only works for so long before people start, being angry about that. And while I don't necessarily need the medication to function at my job, I make a lot more mistakes without it. But having to choose between being able to perform my job and, being able to build a cool project for my stream on the weekend, it's kind of annoying. Mm-hmm. So I probably need to go back to the therapist, especially now that I moved to Washington, and be like, I need to try something new. What else is there out there now? But I've been through so many different medications that there's very few left available to me to try. And that scares me a little bit.
Well, and hopefully that's the thing too, is like there's still research being done, there's still medications being created. So there's always the chance that something that you don't have access to now or didn't have access to earlier might be available at a future date. So
there is, and there isn't. Like there's a new drug, I think it's called Vyvanse, that was made somewhat recently. That's not like any of the older medications. It's a different class of drug. And don't quote me on this. I may be wrong in my memory here, but that's what I've been looking at to try. But because it's a name brand drug and it's relatively new, it costs a lot. Even with insurance, like I think it's classed as like a tier 3 on my insurance. So it would cost me like $75 a month for treatment.
Ooh.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Just for, the chance to maybe for it to work. Whereas Adderall has a million generics and has been around forever. So it cost me $10 to get it filled.
Well, and that's with insurance. I hear without insurance, Adderall is still very affordable for those that, are having similar struggles and are worried about that kind of thing. Since it's been out for so long, I hear Adderall is one of those ones that is actually fairly affordable, even if you don't have a current insurance plan. So, which you hopefully you do.
I do have to make the disclaimer. I am not a medical professional. This is not medical advice. Please see your doctor.
Don't point at me when you're talking about it.
And this is just my own experience with this. Mm-hmm. But I have done my homework on it a lot of the time because, this is a condition that affects my everyday life. It's something that I need to know about. And much like my scoliosis, when I had that, I dug deep into that. And when I had my problems, when I first started to take SSRIs in college for a lot of the issues that I had back then, that caused me a lot of problems too. So I dug deep into that research. So most of my journey has been, I have X problem. Why do I have X problem? Dive into it, do the research, figure out why I have this. What are the treatments for it? What are other people's experiences on it? And that's just been how I've been on this journey. But kind of the more recent discovery was autism.
And we'll go over that. Actually, that's a good place to end. So thank you for giving us that information on ADHD. The next episode, we'll go more into the autism side, because that's going to be a whole separate diagnosis and a whole separate, I believe.
That was a whole journey on its own. Yep.
And so we'll talk about post-college life. We'll go into, it might be the fourth episode. We'll get there when we get there. But we'll go into your experience with autism. We're going to dive a lot more into the furry fandom and your experience getting more involved with that. The friends you've made and how that's helped you in your life. And so these are all things to look forward to in the next episode or two on Pause for My Tell podcast. We thank you guys for coming. If you liked what you watched, hit the subscribe button. I don't know where it is. It's somewhere on your screen.
Somewhere.
That helps us a ton, especially because we're getting started with the YouTube. I don't know the algorithms, how they work. I'm just told they're there. But thanks again for watching. Thanks, Chaotic, for being with us again. And we'll see you all on the next episode. Thanks.
Bye-bye.